June 4, 1942. 10:24 a.m., 200 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. On the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamanyu Maguchi watches his sister ships, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu when he sees something that should be impossible. American dive bombers bursting through the clouds. In the next 5 minutes, the Empire of Japan would lose the war in the Pacific. 6 months earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. In just 150 days, Japan had built an empire that took European powers centuries to create. At the top was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a naval genius who had studied at Harvard and understood America better than any other Japanese commander. And Yamamoto knew something his peers refused to accept. Japan had 6 months, maybe a year, before American industrial power crushed them. So his solution was simple and terrifying: destroy America's aircraft carriers in one decisive blow. Yamamoto's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Attack Midway, a tiny atoll barely visible on most maps, and force the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle. He brought 4 elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Haru, the Kido Butai, the deadliest carrier strike force the world had ever seen. These were the same ships that attacked Pearl Harbor, the same pilots, the same undefeated crews. But there was one problem. The Americans knew they were coming. And the man who cracked the Japanese codes was 3,000 miles away, working in a basement at Pearl Harbor. The man who broke the code, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, didn't look like a war hero. He worked underground at Pearl Harbor, often wearing a bathrobe and slippers because the air conditioning constantly failed. Rochefort leads Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's most secret code-breaking unit. In the weeks before Midway, his team intercepted Japanese messages referencing a target called AF. Something big was planned against AF. But what was AF? Some officers in Washington thought it was the Aleutians. Others guessed Fiji, maybe even California. Rochefort had a different theory. AF was Midway, so he set a brilliant trap. Midway was ordered to broadcast an unencrypted message claiming their freshwater desalination system had broken down. 2 days later, a Japanese message was intercepted. AF is experiencing a shortage of fresh water. Confirmation the Japanese were coming to Midway. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans would have the element of surprise. Racing against time, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had only 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Repairs were estimated to take 3 months. Nimitz gave the engineers 72 hours. They worked non-stop, welding in the dark, hammering while the ship was already underway. When Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor 3 days later, 1,400 civilian workers were still on board, finishing repairs at sea. But even with 3 carriers against Japan's 4, it wasn't enough. The Americans needed luck, and they needed the Japanese to make a mistake. The fatal decision. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 a.m., Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from the Akagi, launched the first strike against Midway 108 aircraft. Nagumo was cautious, kept half his planes on deck, armed with anti-ship torpedoes, in case American carriers appeared. That was Japanese doctrine. Always keep a reserve. At 7 a.m., the planes returned. The strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, sent a devastating message. A second attack is required. Midway wasn't destroyed. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes to strike Midway again. They need to be rearmed with land bombs, a process that would take over an hour. No American carriers had been spotted, At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo gave the order that sealed Japan's fate: rearm with land bombs. Below deck, chaos erupted. Torpedoes were removed. Bombs were stacked on hangar floors. Fuel lines were open. There was no time to return weapons to storage. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A delayed reconnaissance plane finally radioed in, sighted 10 enemy ships. Nagumo froze. 10 ships. 15 minutes of radio silence. Then the update appears to include an aircraft carrier. Panic. Nagumo reversed the order. Rearm with torpedoes again. Below deck, the hangars became a nightmare. Bombs and torpedoes everywhere. Fuel hoses connected. The first strike aircraft still needed to land and refuel. At 8:30 a.m., Midway's planes finally began landing. Nagumo needed 40 more minutes. He didn't have them. The sacrifice. 200 miles northeast, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had already launched everything. Instead of waiting for a coordinated strike, he made a bold decision: send the planes immediately. They would arrive scattered, but they would arrive while the Japanese were vulnerable. What followed was one of the most tragic and heroic sequences of the war. First came the torpedo bombers, slow, obsolete, hopelessly outmatched. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Commander John Waldron, attacked alone. They were annihilated. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the water, watching the battle unfold. Then Torpedo Squadron 6, destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 3, wiped out. Of 41 American torpedo planes, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. It was a massacre, but their sacrifice did something critical. They pulled every Japanese fighter down to sea level. 5 minutes that changed history. At 10:22 a.m., as Japanese fighters climbed to refuel, 33 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers emerged from the clouds at 13,000 feet. Below them, the Japanese carriers sat in perfect formation, decks packed with fueled aircraft, bombs and torpedoes stacked below. Fuel lines still connected. Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise selected Akagi and Kaga. Commander Max Leslie from Yorktown dove on Soryu. What happened next has been called the most decisive moment of World War II. 10:24. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit Akagi. Chain explosions ripped through the hangars. 10:25 Soryu is torn apart by 3 direct hits. 10:26 Kaga is struck by 4 bombs. Fueled aircraft explode like fireworks. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 elite carriers became burning wrecks. Nagumo barely escaped Akagi as flames consumed the bridge, but the battle wasn't over. 1 carrier remained. The last stand. Hiryu, positioned farther north, had escaped the attack. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aggressive, fearless, Princeton educated, saw his sister's ships burning. He counterattacked. Everything he had went after Yorktown, and they hit. Bombs, torpedoes. Yorktown, repaired in 72 hours, was dying, but her crew survived, and then Spruance struck back. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu, 4 bombs. The last carrier of the Kido Butai was finished. That night, Yamaguchi sent his final message to Yamamoto: "I intend to go down with the ship." At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, witnesses saw Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku singing the Japanese naval anthem as Hiryu sank beneath the waves. The turning point. 3,000 Japanese sailors died that day. Over 300 aircraft lost. Pilots Japan could never replace. Yamamoto knew it was over. He canceled the invasion, ordered a full retreat. The Navy that conquered the Pacific in 6 months was now fleeing. Yamamoto had said Japan had 6 months. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single morning. From Midway onward, Japan would never win another offensive naval battle. The 5 minutes between 10:24 and 10:29 a.m. changed world history. All because one intelligence officer broke a code in a basement. Engineers repaired a ship in 3 days instead of 3 months, and 37 young men flew obsolete planes straight into death so others could succeed. This is the true story of Midway.